In this video, I'll go over the basics of the National Service Criminal History Check and the monitoring process of the checks at YouthBuild USA. You can always refer to the YouthBuild AmeriCorps Financial Management Manual for more information on how the monitoring of these checks is incorporated into the AmeriCorps budget as well as the reimbursement process. So what is a National Service Criminal History Check? The National Service Criminal History Check, often referred to as the NSCHC, is a baseline screening requirement established by law to protect the beneficiaries of national service. The NSCHC is required under the National and Community Service Act of 1990, as amended by the Serve America Act, and these regulations are very specific as to what a National Service Criminal History Check is. Someone at your program should be the expert on the National Service Criminal History Check process, and this expert should be able to answer the following questions. Who needs a National Service Criminal History Check? How many searches are part of the check? How many steps are part of the check? When does the check need to happen? And what is the National Service Criminal History Check looking for? So let's cover the basics. Who needs a National Service Criminal History Check? The answer is all AmeriCorps grant covered positions. So anyone receiving a salary as either expense or match, living allowance, or education award on an AmeriCorps grant. So staff listed in the budget and all AmeriCorps members would be defined as a covered position. How many searches are part of the National Service Criminal History Check? The NSCHC is a 3-search process to determine eligibility to serve or work on the AmeriCorps grants. These searches include the National Sex Offender Registry search, a state of work or service and state of residence criminal record search. So if a staff or member is living in one state and working and serving in another state, both state checks are needed. And a national FBI fingerprint-based search. Your company's standard background checks likely will not satisfy AmeriCorps requirements. These are very specific searches, and background check vendors do not always supply what is necessary. How many steps are part of the National Service Criminal History Check process? So there are 3 parts of the criminal history check, but after those are completed, there is a final step. So step 4 is documentation of checks conducted, reviewed, and an eligibility determination made by the program. And here is a visual of the 3 searches and 4 key steps. So once again, the 3 searches are the National Sex Offender Registry search, the state of service or state of residency criminal record search, the FBI fingerprint-based search, and when these searches are done, a documented adjudication and eligibility determination needs to be made. To someone new, this may seem simple enough, but in between these 4 steps, there are a lot of little steps. Permission needs to be obtained. The legal name must be used exactly as it is spelled on the ID, and there needs to be a process for challenging results if results are inaccurate. Our team has identified 12 ways to make a mistake in completing and documenting this process. If a mistake is made, it's a non-compliant NSCHC, which means disallowed costs, which are typically staff salaries, and if it is a full-time member, it would be the disallowance of the member living allowance. When does the National Service Criminal History Check need to happen? No later than the day before a person's first day of work or service on the AmeriCorps grant. So you can have staff at your program working on the grant, but they cannot be charged to the grant until they have the NSCHC in place. What is the National Service Criminal History Check looking for? It's looking for individuals that are registered or required to be registered on a sex offender registry and or convicted of murder. AmeriCorps has worked to secure 2 vendors to help wrap up this process in an easier way. TrueScreen handles the state and NSOPW checks. It's facilitated online. It documents the consent of checks, documents the ID and identity of the person receiving the check. It facilitates the NSOPW check, ensuring that all states and territories are included in the check, conducts the state of service and state of residency checks, makes an adjudication recommendation, and documents results and adjudication by the program. FieldPrint is the national FBI fingerprint-based search. It's managed online, but you need to get your fingerprints scanned at a FieldPrint office, and some of our larger Youth Build programs have actually become their own FieldPrint locations. It documents the ID and identity of the person receiving the check, facilitates a national fingerprint-based FBI search, makes an adjudication recommendation, and also documents results and adjudication by the program. So these 2 vendors exist to help mitigate risk at local Youth Build programs, and they take care of the first 3 steps of the process. Youth Build USA has required programs to use these vendors along with the Youth Build USA eligibility verification form to document adjudication review and eligibility determination by the program. Someone on the program side at your program, who would be your NSCHC expert, would have received more in-depth information on these 4 steps, as well as completing a required online course that is a mandated grant requirement each year. So just know that this video is an overview of the process for fiscal staff in order to provide an understanding of how this impacts covered positions charged to the AmeriCorps grants. How often do I get the NSCHC? It is a one-time process. As long as you are continuously employed or serving with a gap of no more than 180 days. So to recap the basics, who needs them? All covered positions. What are the 3 parts of the check? The NSOPW, the state of service or state of residence check, and the FBI fingerprint-based search. When do they happen? No later than the day before the start of service or before staff start charging time to the grants. And why do we need them? To protect vulnerable populations and to protect the investments. Next, let's look at the monitoring process and how the NSCHC impacts both your budget and reimbursement of the grants. Staff and member NSCHCs are low-hanging fruit for the Office of Inspector General. So Youth Build USA has preventative measures in place to help catch any issues of noncompliance before they are charged to the grants. But preventative measures don't always catch every issue of noncompliance, so there are also corrective actions for when issues are discovered during site visits or through routine desktop monitoring. AmeriCorps expects grantees to meet the on-time, every-time requirements. The penalties for noncompliance is disallowance and repayment based on support costs, which could be the living allowance for full-time members or staff salaries. So depending on how long a staff person has been billed to the grant prior to a compliant NSCHC, up to 6 months of this person's salary could be disallowed. And if it is a full-time member who is out of compliance, it would be the member living allowance that would be disallowed. Now let's take a look at the preventative monitoring process. Staff checks are reviewed by portfolio managers at Youth Build USA during the budgeting process. Each staff check is reviewed once. It's not kept on file, but we do record clearance dates. And this date is then added to your fiscal reporting templates, such as the budget, the expense and match worksheets, as well as the staff summary to make sure staff time is not reported prior to the clearance dates. We review staff check documentation as part of budget creation or in the modification process in order to obtain clearance dates. You can only charge time after the date the documentation shows all checks have been completed or initiated to prevent at-cost disallowance. And finally, reimbursements are withheld until checks are reviewed. So here is the ideal situation for the process. First, a staff person starts working at your organization. They complete the NSCHC before they work on the grants. The program requests a budget modification, at which point YouthBuild USA staff will request and collect the documentation. Once they are reviewed, we approve the budget modification and update your reporting templates with the NSCHC clearance dates. And finally, you can submit for reimbursement based on the information in the updated template. And here is the scenario that we want to avoid. So a staff person starts work but does not complete the NSCHC. The program attempts to charge this person to the grant in a reimbursement request, but your AmeriCorps financial manager would reject the request and remind the program that the check needs to be run. So now the program has to run the check well after the start date of this individual and provide documentation to YouthBuild USA for review. And finally, once the check is reviewed and approved, the reimbursement process can then move forward. The result of this scenario could be a gap of time between when a staff person starts and when the check is run, and this time would need to be charged to another funder. It can also result in a gap between when a reimbursement is submitted and when it is actually approved for reimbursements. And also, all the extra work for the program and YouthBuild USA to redo the reimbursement documentation and to review it again. Now let's do a quick review of the NSCHC monitoring process. Who needs to have checks reviewed by YouthBuild USA? It's staff listed on the budget as either expense or match, and members receiving a living allowance. When are they reviewed? During the budget process, or whenever someone new is added to the budget. Are all staff member checks reviewed each year? The answer is no, just new staff. What is the first date staff time can be charged to the grants? It's the date after the check has been completed. YouthBuild USA issues that clearance date. And why do we perform this monitoring? To prevent at-cost disallowance and to protect the investment. Fiscal staff will notice these clearance dates throughout the reimbursement workbook to help ensure staff time is not charged prior to the clearance date. Here is a snapshot of where the date appears on the monthly expense worksheet. These dates and staff names are linked directly to the approved AmeriCorps budget. And here is another snapshot of the staff summary tab in the reimbursement workbook. And this is also linked to your approved AmeriCorps budget. And so if issues of noncompliance are found, YouthBuild USA is required to expand the scope to look at other staff and members at the program. We would then determine a disallowance calculation based on the AmeriCorps Enforcement Guide. We would then provide it to AmeriCorps, who then issues a disallowance statement, which is then followed by a repayment process. So thanks for watching, and remember, you can always contact your AmeriCorps financial manager with questions regarding the NSCHC process or to facilitate a budget modification to include new staff.